My husband handed me divorce papers in the church reception hall after his mother's funeral. "I need to move on, Eleanor," he whispered between condolence hugs. Then came the words that shattered my world. "Patricia makes me feel young again." I accepted the envelope with steady hands and a dignified expression, though inside I felt the foundation of my life crumbling beneath me. What Harold didn't realize as he betrayed me during the most inappropriate moment possible was that I had been quietly preparing for this possibility for nearly 6 months, and my response would leave him devastated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was a crisp Tuesday in October when we buried my mother-in-law, Margaret. Despite our complicated relationship over the decades, I had genuinely mourned her passing. At 67, I had known her for nearly 50 years, longer than I'd known my own mother, who passed when I was just 23. Margaret had been a formidable woman, opinionated and strong-willed, qualities that had often put us at odds but that I'd secretly admired. The elegant mahogany casket was adorned with white roses and lilies, Margaret's favorites. I had selected them myself, along with the hymns for the service and the photographs for the memorial display. Harold had been too overwhelmed to handle these details, retreating into a distant silence in the days following his mother's death. Or so I had thought. Now I wondered if his distraction had been due to entirely different preparations. I'd spent the entire week making arrangements that Harold seemed incapable of handling in his supposed grief. I'd selected Margaret's burial dress, the elegant, navy blue ensemble she'd worn to our daughter Jennifer's wedding. I'd coordinated with the funeral home, arranged the reception catering, and helped our grandchildren understand what was happening. I'd even written the obituary when Harold couldn't find the words, carefully highlighting Margaret's community service and devotion to her family, including her beloved son Harold and his wife of 45 years, Eleanor. The funeral service had been lovely, with St. Matthew's Episcopal Church filled to capacity. Margaret's friends from her garden club, bridge group, and charitable organizations filled the pews, dabbing at their eyes as the Reverend spoke of a life well lived. I'd stood beside Harold, my hand supportively on his arm, as dozens of people shared what his mother had meant to them. Our grown children, Jennifer, David, and Michael, sat in the front row with their spouses and children. The perfect picture of a family united in grief. After the service, we gathered in the church reception hall where I'd arranged for a caterer to provide refreshments. The room hummed with conversation as people shared memories of Margaret over coffee and delicate pastries. I was speaking with Margaret's oldest friend, Doris, when Harold approached, his face a mask I couldn't quite read. "Eleanor, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked, his tone overly formal. I excused myself from Doris and followed Harold into a small side room used for church committee meetings. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn carpet. That's when he pulled an envelope from inside his suit jacket, a simple white business envelope that would change everything. "This isn't the ideal time," he began, not meeting my eyes. "But with everyone already gathered, I thought it might be efficient." Efficient. The word hung in the air between us, cold and calculating. After 45 years of marriage, he had reduced our uncoupling to a matter of efficient scheduling, as though divorcing me were simply another item on his administrative agenda. "I've had these drawn up," he continued, handing me the envelope. "The terms are generous. The house, a substantial monthly payment, and half of the retirement accounts." I took the envelope without opening it, feeling its weight in my hands, heavier than paper should be. "At your mother's funeral, Harold? Really?" He had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, but then his expression hardened, transforming into the decisive administrator he'd become over decades of hospital management. "It's time for both of us to move forward. You must have realized things haven't been right between us for years." I studied his face, the face I had woken up to for nearly half a century. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hair had thinned and grayed, but I still saw echoes of the ambitious young man who had promised we would build something meaningful together. Now, he was dismantling that something with the same methodical efficiency he applied to hospital restructuring. "And Patricia?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "How long has she been part of your forward movement?" His expression registered surprise, then resignation. "How did you— The cologne you've started wearing after 4 decades of Old Spice," I interrupted. "The mysterious golf tournaments that don't appear on the club's calendar. The password-protected folder on your laptop labeled P Investment. I may be old, Harold, but I'm not blind." He stared at me. This man I'd built a life with, raised children with. The man whose career I'd supported while putting my own ambitions aside. The man I'd nursed through a heart attack 7 years earlier. In that moment, he was a stranger standing in a room filled with colored light. "Sign the papers, Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used during his years as a hospital administrator. "We can tell the children together tomorrow. Patricia's place isn't far from the country club. You'll maintain your social connections, and everyone will adjust." The presumption in his voice that I would simply comply, that I would fold myself neatly into whatever future he had designed, sparked something beyond pain. A quiet anger began to smolder, not the explosive kind that burns hot and fast, but the slow-burning kind that forges steel. I slipped the envelope into my purse without opening it. "I'll review these with an attorney, of course, Eleanor," he began, sounding irritated at this minor deviation from his script. "Not now, Harold," I said firmly. "We're at your mother's funeral. I believe Reverend Phillips is about to say a final blessing." I walked out of that small room with my spine straight and my head high, rejoining the gathering as if my world hadn't just imploded. I stood beside our children as the Reverend spoke, Harold a few feet away, separate from our family unit for perhaps the first time. The geometric patterns from the stained glass windows fell across the gathered mourners, fracturing the light just as my life had been fractured in an instant. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Harold had left to Patricia's, presumably, though he claimed he needed space to grieve, I sat in our living room surrounded by sympathy flower arrangements. The house suddenly felt cavernous after a day filled with people and noise. The ticking of the grandfather clock. In the hallway, a wedding gift from Harold's parents, marked time with merciless precision. I removed the envelope from my purse and opened it. The divorce agreement was comprehensive, clearly prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. The settlement appeared generous on the surface. Our house of 30 years in Brookline's prestigious Pill Hill neighborhood, half of our considerable retirement savings, monthly support of $12,000 that would maintain my comfortable lifestyle. But as I reviewed the details, I noticed significant omissions. No mention of the vacation property in Maine that had been in Harold's family for generations, but that I had renovated and maintained for decades. No acknowledgement of my stake in the medical consulting business Harold had built, a business I had helped establish, functioning as unpaid administrator during its critical early years while also raising our children. Most significantly, no reference to the significant inheritance Harold had received from his father 15 years earlier. Money we had both agreed to invest rather than spend, money that had appreciated substantially under careful management. I set the papers aside and walked to the windows overlooking the garden I had cultivated for 3 decades. Fall chrysanthemums bloomed in carefully planned color groupings, bronze, deep red, and gold, their beauty stark against the knowledge that this would likely be my last autumn in this home. Despite the settlement's provision allowing me to keep the house, I knew I wouldn't stay. Too many memories, too much Harold in every room. The home I had made beautiful, comfortable, and welcoming now felt like a consolation prize. A gilded cage where I could live out my remaining years in comfortable invisibility, while Harold began his new life with Patricia. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia, who at 57 was hardly young, but whose childless, career-focused life represented a freedom I had sacrificed decades ago. At 67, I was being asked to start over. To redefine myself not as one half of Harold and Eleanor Bennett, but simply as Eleanor, a woman suddenly alone after nearly half a century of partnership. The prospect was terrifying. It was also, I realized with growing clarity, an opportunity I had never expected to have. As I watched darkness settle over my garden, something shifted inside me. The initial shock and pain began to crystallize into something different, a quiet, steady determination. Harold clearly expected me to follow the script he'd written for our separation. A dignified, uncontested divorce where I accepted his terms, disappeared quietly to a respectable but separate life, and allowed him to begin anew with Patricia, without complications. What he didn't realize, what he had perhaps never truly understood, was that the accommodating, supportive wife he had taken for granted for 45 years had always been far stronger and more resourceful than he'd given her credit for. That night, as I lay awake in our bed, a bed Harold had not slept in for weeks, claiming back problems required the guest room mattress, I made a decision. I would not rage against Harold or Patricia. I would not create a public spectacle or demand immediate explanations. I would not play the devastated, discarded wife. Instead, I would approach this challenge as I had approached every major hurdle in my life, with patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. Harold had made his move at his mother's funeral, believing the timing would leave me too stunned and emotionally fragile to respond effectively. He had severely miscalculated. In the darkness of our bedroom, with moonlight filtering through curtains, I had selected years ago, I began to formulate a plan. Not for revenge. Revenge implied emotional volatility, a desire to hurt rather than heal. What I sought was recognition of my contributions, my sacrifices, my worth. And perhaps, most importantly, a future shaped by my own choices rather than Harold's calculations. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. when I finally drifted toward sleep, a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time in decades, I would be making decisions based solely on what was best for me, not what accommodated Harold's career or preferences. There was fear in that freedom, but also an unexpected exhilaration. Harold had handed me divorce papers at his mother's funeral, assuming my grief and shock would render me passive. Instead, he had unwittingly provided the catalyst for my transformation from supportive wife to formidable adversary. In the coming weeks, he would discover exactly who I had been all along, beneath the accommodating exterior he had taken for granted. I fell asleep with a slight smile on my lips, already anticipating the moment when Harold would realize his grave miscalculation. The moment he would understand that in attempting to discard me with efficiency, he had instead awakened a strength and resolve he never knew I possessed. I met Harold Bennett in 1977 at a hospital fundraiser in Boston. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, crystal chandeliers sparkling overhead as Boston's medical elite mingled and networked. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school at Boston University, idealistic about changing healthcare, and completely out of my element among the city's wealthy donors. I remember exactly what I was wearing that night. A blue silk dress borrowed from my roommate Sarah that was slightly too large in the shoulders and uncomfortable heels. That had me seated at a side table nursing a glass of champagne when Harold approached. "You look too intelligent to be enjoying this," he said, offering me a fresh glass of champagne as he sat down uninvited. I accepted the champagne, but raised an eyebrow. "That's quite an opener. Is intelligence incompatible with charity functions?" He laughed, genuinely delighted by my response. "Not at all. but most people here are networking or showing off their donations. You look like you're observing a slightly confusing anthropological experiment. He wasn't wrong. As a scholarship student from a modest background in Western Massachusetts, I felt distinctly out of place. My nursing supervisor had insisted I attend, claiming these connections would be valuable for my career. I hadn't expected to make the most significant connection of my life. "I'm Eleanor Clark," I said, offering my hand. "First-year nurse at Boston Memorial." "Harold Bennett," he replied, his grip firm and confident. "Future revolutionizer of hospital administration, current graduate student drowning in research papers." He was handsome in a serious way. Intelligent brown eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, dark hair neatly combed, tall and lean in a well-tailored suit that spoke of family money. But it wasn't his appearance that captivated me. It was his vision. As we talked through that evening, Harold described healthcare systems where patients weren't just medical cases but people, where preventive care received as much attention as treatment, where hospitals functioned as community resources rather than isolated institutions. That evening began a whirlwind courtship. Harold was different from anyone I'd dated before, intellectually ambitious, politically engaged, with a genuine passion for reforming healthcare from within. He talked about patient-centered approaches and community outreach programs when such concepts were still considered radical. His ideas resonated with my own experiences nursing in overcrowded city hospitals, where bureaucracy often seemed to take precedence over patient care. Our backgrounds couldn't have been more different. I came from a practical working-class family. My father a high school science teacher, my mother a librarian who had died of breast cancer just the year before. Harold was the son of Dr. Edward Bennett, a prominent surgeon whose family had practiced medicine in Boston for 3 generations. The Bennetts lived in Brookline, belonged to the country club, summered in Maine, and assumed Harold would follow the family tradition into surgery. His decision to pursue hospital administration rather than medicine had created significant tension with his parents, particularly his mother Margaret, who viewed it as choosing a lesser path. "Anyone can be an administrator," she told him in my presence during one particularly tense dinner. "Bennetts heal with their hands." Perhaps this rebellion against family expectations was what initially drew us together. We were both pushing against convention in our own ways. I was determined to advance in nursing beyond what was expected of women in the profession at that time. Harold was rejecting a path that had been predetermined since his birth. 6 months after we met, Harold proposed on the harbor walkway as the sun set over the water, presenting both a ring and a vision. We would build something meaningful together, a partnership of equals pursuing a shared dream of more compassionate, accessible healthcare. "We'll be unstoppable together," he promised, his face earnest in the harbor lights. "Your compassion and my ambition will make real change happen." I believed him completely. At 23, with my mother recently deceased and my father remarried to a woman who made it clear I was no longer a priority, Harold's certainty about our future felt like solid ground beneath my feet. I said yes without hesitation, slipping his grandmother's Art Deco diamond onto my finger. We married that December in a small ceremony that neither family fully embraced. Margaret Bennett attended with visible disapproval, her mink coat and perfect pearls seeming to radiate judgment of my simple dress and modest family. She made it clear she'd expected her only son to marry someone from their social circle, preferably a doctor's daughter with the right connections. My father came without his new wife, staying only briefly at the reception before driving back to Springfield. The early years were both challenging and exhilarating. We lived in a small apartment near the hospital where I worked night shifts, while Harold finished his master's program at Boston University. Our furniture was a mismatched collection of hand-me-downs and yard sale finds. We cooked dinner together in our tiny kitchen and spent evenings discussing healthcare policies and dreaming about the future. Money was tight despite occasional help from his parents, help that always came with Margaret's subtle reminders that A different choice of career or wife might have made such assistance unnecessary. "The Carmichael girl is engaged to a neurosurgeon now," she would mention casually. "They've bought that lovely tutor in Newton." When Harold graduated with his master's in healthcare administration, we moved to Chicago for his first administrative position at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I transferred my nursing credentials and found work in the pediatric ward, a specialty I'd grown to love. For 3 wonderful years, we truly were partners pursuing parallel careers, coming home to share stories and challenges, supporting each other's professional growth. My supervisor had begun suggesting I consider an advanced degree in nursing administration. "You have a gift for systems thinking," she told me. "You could make real changes in how nursing care is delivered." Harold encouraged me to apply to programs, and I began researching options, excited about expanding my own professional horizons. Everything changed when I became pregnant with Jennifer in 1982. What should have been a joyous time became complicated when severe morning sickness, then preeclampsia, made continuing work impossible. My carefully planned career advancement was put on hold as my pregnancy became increasingly high risk. Jennifer arrived safely, but only after weeks of bed rest and an emergency C-section. My recovery was difficult, and by the time I was physically able to return to work, Harold had been offered a significant promotion that would require longer hours and more travel. With no family nearby for support, the logical solution seemed to be for me to remain home with Jennifer while Harold pursued the career that could support our growing family. "It's just for a few years," Harold assured me as I officially resigned from nursing. "Once Jennifer's in school, you can go back, maybe even get that advanced degree you've talked about." Those few years stretched indefinitely. David arrived just 18 months after Jennifer, and then Michael completed our family in 1986. By the time Michael started kindergarten, Harold had accepted a position back in Boston, a significant promotion to assistant hospital director that would advance his career, but require even more of his time and attention. The demands of relocating our family, settling the children into new schools, and rebuilding our social network fell entirely to me. While I'd once envisioned returning to nursing once all the children were in school, the reality of managing 3 active children, a large house, and the social obligations associated with Harold's position made that dream increasingly remote. Boston brought us back into Margaret's orbit. By then, Harold's father had passed away from a stroke, leaving Margaret a wealthy widow with excessive interest in our family's affairs. She had clear ideas about how her grandchildren should be raised, what activities were appropriate, which schools they should attend. Her financial contributions to their education gave weight to her opinions, creating a complex dynamic I navigated daily. The children should attend St. Mark's, she insisted over Sunday dinner at her Beacon Hill townhouse. "It's where men have always been educated." "We're considering the public schools in Brookline," I countered. "They're excellent and more diverse." Margaret's mouth tightened with disapproval. "Diverse is not always better, Eleanor. Connections matter. The right school leads to the right college leads to the right career." These subtle battles over everything from education to vacation destinations to what sports the children should play became the background noise of our family life. Harold, caught between his mother's expectations and my more progressive viewpoints, often retreated into his work, leaving me to manage both the children and Margaret. Harold's career flourished throughout the 1990s. He became known for innovative approaches to hospital management, eventually being recruited to lead Boston Memorial, the very hospital where we'd met. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had once walked those same halls as a nursing professional, and now entered them as Mrs. Bennett, the administrator's wife, at fundraising events. I channeled my healthcare knowledge and organizational skills into volunteer work, serving on hospital auxiliary boards and healthcare advocacy committees. I became involved in community health initiatives, particularly those serving underprivileged neighborhoods. This work was meaningful and used my training, but always existed in the shadow of Harold's official position. Our marriage settled into comfortable patterns. We weren't the passionate young couple we'd once been, but we had built a good life. Our children thrived, Jennifer following her father into healthcare administration, David becoming an attorney, and Michael pursuing scientific research. We had a beautiful home in Brookline, a summer cottage on the Maine coast, and a social circle of accomplished, interesting people. If Harold sometimes seemed distant or preoccupied, I attributed it to the stresses of his position. If our conversations centered more on practical household matters and less on dreams and ideas, I told myself this was natural evolution in a long marriage. If intimacy had become infrequent and perfunctory, well, we were in our 60s after all. I had constructed a narrative of our life together that made sense to me. We had made necessary compromises for the greater good of our family. My sacrifices had enabled Harold's success, which in turn provided our children with opportunities neither of us had enjoyed. It was a partnership of complementary contributions, even if the outside world assigned different values to our respective roles. 7. Years ago, when Harold suffered a heart attack at 62, these patterns intensified. I managed his recovery with the precision my nursing background provided, overseeing medications, coordinating with doctors, implementing the recommended lifestyle changes. I researched heart-healthy diets, learned to prepare specialized meals, and gently but firmly enforced exercise regimens and stress management techniques. The crisis temporarily brought us closer. Harold, facing his mortality for perhaps the first time, showed a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Ellie," he said one night, using the nickname from our early years that had gradually disappeared from our daily vocabulary. For a brief period, I glimpsed the young man I had fallen in love with, thoughtful, appreciative, engaged with me as a person rather than as a function in his well-ordered life. We had conversations about aging, about regrets, about what we wanted from our remaining years. I dared to hope that this health crisis might lead to a renewal of our connection. Harold recovered fully, returning to work with renewed energy after 6 months. But the reconnection I had hoped for faded as his strength returned. Instead, the experience seemed to have awakened something different in him. Not appreciation for our shared life, but a desperate grasp at youth and vitality. He joined a fitness club, updated his wardrobe, and developed a sudden interest in golf, a sport he'd previously dismissed as walking interrupted by disappointment. He began attending medical conferences he would have delegated to subordinates in the past, extending these trips by days for networking opportunities. I was initially pleased by these changes, viewing them as positive adaptations to a health crisis successfully navigated. When he began spending more time away from home, I attributed it to a healthy reclaiming of independence after the vulnerability of serious illness. When he became more protective of his privacy, password protecting his devices, taking calls, in another room, I respected what I believed was his need to reassert boundaries after months of intensive caregiving. I had spent so many years accommodating Harold's needs and preferences that these new behaviors seemed simply another adaptation required of me. In retrospect, the signs were all there. The new cologne that replaced the Old Spice he'd worn since our honeymoon. The precisely pressed shirts when Harold had previously been indifferent to such details. The budget meetings that didn't appear on his shared calendar. The sudden interest in his mother's antique watch collection, which Patricia apparently shared due to her own family history in jewelry making. Patricia Miller joined the hospital board 3 years ago, a wealthy widow 10 years my junior whose late husband had left her a considerable fortune and a prominent position in Boston philanthropy. I had met her at hospital functions, finding her pleasant if somewhat superficial. With her perfect ash blonde bob, tasteful designer clothing, and background in art history, she represented exactly the type of woman Margaret had always believed. Harold should have married. I might never have confirmed my growing suspicions had Margaret not fallen ill earlier this year. A series of strokes left her physically diminished, but with moments of startling lucidity between periods of confusion. During one of my regular visits to the care facility, as I adjusted her pillows and helped her with tea, she fixed me with a clear, penetrating gaze. "He's just like his father," she told me, patting my hand with unexpected sympathy. "Edward had a Patricia too. Different name, same story. I learned to look the other way. The Bennett men always come home eventually." The revelation stunned me. Not just the confirmation of Harold's affair, but the implication that his father had behaved similarly, and that Margaret had accepted such treatment as inevitable. It offered a new lens through which to view my mother-in-law's often critical attitude toward me over the decades. Perhaps she had been trying, in her own flawed way, to prepare me for what she saw as an unavoidable disappointment. "You know about Patricia, then?" Margaret asked, studying my expression. "I suspected," I admitted quietly. "I didn't know for certain." Margaret sighed, suddenly looking every day of her 92 years. "I could have warned you years ago. I saw it in him even before you married. That Bennett restlessness. They're brilliant. Men, but they're never satisfied, always looking for the next challenge, the next conquest." She patted my hand again. "You've been a better wife to Harold than I ever was to Edward. More patient. Kinder." "Did you ever consider leaving?" I asked, the question escaping before I could reconsider. A flicker of surprise crossed Margaret's face, followed by something that might have been regret. "Leave? And go where? Do what?" Being Mrs. Dr. Bennett defined my entire adult life. Without that, who would I have been? The question echoed in my mind long after I left Margaret's room that day. Without Harold, who would I be? After nearly half a century of being Mrs. Bennett, what remained of Eleanor Clark, the ambitious young nurse with dreams of her own? In the months following this conversation, as Margaret's condition deteriorated, I began quietly investigating. Not confronting, not accusing, simply gathering information. The password to Harold's laptop was our anniversary date, another painful irony. His emails contained nothing explicit, but the frequency of communications with Patricia about matters tangentially related to hospital business told its own story. The P investment folder required more effort to access, but decades of managing family documents meant I knew where Harold stored important information. Inside were property listings for condominiums in Florida, research on retirement communities, and, most revealing, documentation for a newly established trust with Patricia Miller as the primary beneficiary. I discovered that Harold had been systematically moving funds from our joint investments into separate accounts for the past year. Nothing illegal, he was careful about that, but a clear preparation for financial separation. The discovery hurt more than the affair itself. It represented not just emotional betrayal, but a calculated dismantling of our shared life. For the next 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, I lived a carefully choreographed double life. To Harold and our social circle, I was Eleanor Bennett, shell-shocked but dignified wife processing the end of her long marriage with appropriate privacy. I attended necessary social functions, maintained pleasant but brief phone conversations with Harold about practical matters, and responded to concerned inquiries from friends with vague references to a difficult transition period. When our children called with questions about their father's increasingly obvious absence, I deflected gently. "Your father and I are working through some changes," I told Jennifer during her weekly Sunday call. "We'll explain everything together, once we've reached clarity." This wasn't what Harold had proposed. He'd wanted to tell them immediately about our mutual decision to divorce. But I had insisted on postponement, claiming grief over Margaret needed to settle first. Harold agreed, likely believing this delay served his interest by giving me time to accept the inevitable. In reality, it gave me precious weeks to implement the strategy I was developing, a strategy that would force Harold to see me clearly, perhaps for the first time in decades. Behind this calm facade, I was methodically building my case. Each morning, after breakfast, I would retreat to my study, a small sunroom off the living room that Harold rarely entered, and work with the focused concentration I'd once applied to complex patient care. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing financially. I created a comprehensive inventory of our marital assets, documenting when each was acquired and the source of funds used. This proved more challenging than expected. Over 45 years, investments had been liquidated and reinvested, properties bought and sold, inheritances received and allocated. Untangling this history required archaeological precision. I spent long afternoons at our bank, retrieving statements from safety deposit boxes, and speaking with financial advisors who knew our history. Estate planning, I explained with a confident smile when questions arose. At our age, it's important to have everything organized for the children. The bank manager, who had known us for 20 years, never questioned why I suddenly needed documentation going back decades. "Mrs. Bennett," he said respectfully, "your organizational skills have always been impressive. Most couples have no idea where their financial records from the 1980s might be." I also reconstructed the history of Harold's career advancement, carefully noting my specific contributions, from hosting crucial networking events to editing his early articles and presentations, from managing family responsibilities during his frequent work travel to providing unpaid administrative support during his business's formation. The main property required particular attention. Harold claimed it as separate property through family inheritance, but I had documentation proving my substantial investment in its renovation and maintenance. I collected photographs showing the property's transformation from a dilapidated cottage to a charming summer home, along with records of contractors I had hired and supervised, and checks drawn from our joint accounts for improvements. My most significant discovery came during a careful review of Harold's business arrangements. Bennett Healthcare Advisors, the consulting firm he had established alongside his hospital position, continued generating substantial income through intellectual property and systems we had jointly developed during the early years of our marriage. The firm's founding documents, which I located in our home office, clearly listed me as co-founder and administrator. Yet Harold's divorce proposal made no mention of this ongoing revenue stream. I needed professional guidance to properly leverage these discoveries. After careful consideration, I reached out to two women whose expertise I trusted implicitly. Diane Walsh had been a nursing colleague during my brief career, a friend who had gone on to law school and built a reputation as a formidable medical malpractice attorney. We had maintained casual contact over the years through hospital functions and mutual friends. I called her office on a Tuesday morning, requesting a confidential consultation. "Eleanor Bennett," she said warmly when I was shown into her downtown office the following day. "It's been too long." She embraced me briefly before gesturing toward comfortable chairs arranged around a small table, rather than across her imposing desk. A subtle kindness I appreciated. "I need your guidance, Diane," I began, directly and without preamble. "Harold has asked for a divorce after 45 years. I have reason to believe he's been preparing for this for some time, while deliberately keeping me uninformed." Diane's expression remained professional, but I caught the brief flash of surprise in her eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor. Tell me what you know so far." I laid out the situation methodically, the divorce papers delivered at Margaret's funeral, the evidence of Harold's relationship with Patricia, the financial maneuvers I had discovered. Diane listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly observing my composure with what appeared to be growing respect. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and fixed me with a direct gaze. "Eleanor, this level of preparation and financial segregation indicates Harold has been planning this divorce for at least a year, possibly longer. The timing, immediately following his mother's death, suggests he was waiting for that event before proceeding." "I believe so," I agreed. "Margaret knew about Patricia. She essentially confirmed it during a lucid moment in her final months. I think Harold was waiting for her to pass before making his move. The agreement he's proposed, Diane continued, reviewing the document Harold had given me, substantially undervalues your contributions to the marriage and the accumulation of assets. The house and monthly support create an illusion of generosity, while actually representing a fraction of what you're entitled to under Massachusetts law. What do you recommend? I asked. First, don't sign anything. Don't engage in discussions about terms. Second, we need comprehensive financial discovery. All accounts, all holdings, all transfers going back at least 5 years. And most importantly, don't let Harold control the narrative. She leaned forward, her expression intent. Eleanor, men like Harold, successful, respected professionals, are accustomed to managing perceptions. He's likely already constructing a story about your marriage and its end that minimizes his culpability and portrays the divorce as mutual and amicable. We need to ensure that any public understanding reflects reality, not his preferred version. Nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. Harold values his reputation above almost everything. The hospital board, his professional colleagues, even our social circle. He'll want to maintain his standing as the reasonable, generous ex-husband rather than a man abandoning his wife of 45 years for a younger woman. Exactly, Diane confirmed. And that gives us leverage, not for vindictiveness, but for ensuring a truly equitable settlement. The next day, I met with Catherine Rodriguez at her campus office at Boston College. Catherine had been our family accountant for nearly 20 years before retiring to teach forensic accounting. Her office walls were lined with academic credentials alongside photographs of her grandchildren, a woman who, like me, had balanced family and professional life, but with more success at maintaining her career. Eleanor, she greeted me warmly, embracing me with genuine affection. When you called, I was concerned. Is everything all right? Not entirely, I admitted, settling into the chair across from her desk. I need your professional expertise, Catherine, and your absolute discretion. I explained the situation again, this time focusing on the financial aspects, the movement of assets, the hidden accounts, the undervaluation of jointly created business interests. Catherine listened with growing concern, occasionally asking for clarification on specific transactions. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and regarded me thoughtfully. This is methodical financial segregation in preparation for divorce, Eleanor. Based on what you've shared, I estimate Harold has already moved approximately $3 million into vehicles that would be difficult to trace or claim in a standard divorce proceeding. Can he do that legally? I asked. Some of it, yes. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, not community property. But equitable should reflect genuine contribution to the marital assets. Your role in his career success, your management of family affairs that enabled his professional advancement, your unpaid labor in the business's early stages, these all have quantifiable value that his current proposal ignores completely. Catherine introduced me to James Parker, a forensic accountant specializing in high-asset divorce cases. His services wouldn't be inexpensive, but his expertise in tracing financial movements and establishing accurate valuations would prove essential. Harold knows the obvious assets can't be hidden, Catherine explained. It's the less visible ones, intellectual property, business goodwill, strategic investments through multiple entities, where professional scrutiny becomes critical. Armed with these professional alliances, I began constructing a comprehensive strategy. Victoria Sloan, the divorce attorney Diane recommended, became the final crucial member of my team. Unlike the aggressive divorce warriors, whose tactics alienated judges, Victoria had built a reputation for thorough preparation and strategic advocacy that consistently yielded favorable settlements for her clients. Our initial consultation lasted 3 hours, during which Victoria outlined a comprehensive approach to my situation, Based on what you've shared, Harold has been planning this divorce for at least a year, she explained. He's carefully constructed a narrative where your contributions are minimized and certain assets are excluded from consideration. How do we counter that? I asked. By presenting an alternate narrative supported by irrefutable documentation, Victoria replied. Not an emotional appeal, but a factual case demonstrating your partnership role throughout the marriage and your entitlement to a truly equitable distribution. She recommended against immediate confrontation or counteroffers. Right now, Harold believes you're too overwhelmed to challenge him effectively. Let him maintain that misconception while we prepare thoroughly. This strategic patience proved challenging when Harold called a week after the funeral, his tone suggesting irritation. Eleanor, have you reviewed the papers? My attorney is asking about next steps. I've been going through Mother's personal effects, I replied truthfully, though omitting that I'd completed this task within 2 days. The grief has been more overwhelming than expected. A pause, then an audible softening. Of course. I understand. Take the time you need. Always the administrator, he added. But perhaps we could set a date to discuss things, for planning purposes. How? About 3 weeks from today? I suggested. That would be after Jennifer's family visits for Thanksgiving. Harold agreed readily, likely pleased that I was being reasonable and accommodating his timeline. What he didn't know was that this date had been carefully selected in consultation with Victoria, allowing precisely the time needed to complete our preparatory work. During these weeks, I also began quietly reclaiming pieces of myself that had been subsumed by my role as Harold's wife. I contacted former nursing colleagues, some now in healthcare leadership positions themselves. I had lunch with my old mentor from Boston Memorial, Dr. Elizabeth Winters, now the hospital's chief of pediatric services. I've always wondered why you never came back to nursing, Elizabeth said as we caught up over salads in the hospital cafeteria, a place where I had once belonged as a professional rather than a visitor. You were one of the most promising young nurses I'd worked with. Life took a different direction, I replied carefully. Elizabeth studied me thoughtfully. Well, if you're ever interested in returning in some capacity, the profession has evolved. Many experienced nurses now work in patient advocacy, quality improvement, or education roles. Your combination of clinical background and administrative understanding would be valuable. The conversation planted a seed, a possibility I hadn't considered that my professional identity might still be recoverable, even at 67. I also reconnected with community health organizations where I'd volunteered over the years. At a fundraiser for a neighborhood clinic, I encountered Catherine Morgan, the director of a healthcare advocacy foundation focused on improving access for underserved populations. We've always appreciated your insights during board meetings, Catherine commented. Your perspective bridges the gap between clinical understanding and administrative realities, a rare combination. These interactions reinforced what my legal and financial advisors had been emphasizing. My contributions throughout my adult life had tangible value, even if they hadn't been financially compensated or professionally titled. This growing recognition strengthened my resolve as the scheduled meeting with Harold approached. 3 days before our planned discussion, Harold called again. Eleanor, I think we should meet at the house rather than a restaurant. More private. I agree, I replied, though for entirely different reasons than he likely assumed. The privacy would allow me to control the environment and documentation available during our conversation. The night before our meeting, I carefully prepared the dining room table with organized folders containing key financial records. Not everything. We had gathered, Victoria had advised against showing our full hand, but enough to demonstrate that I was far more informed than Harold believed. I also prepared myself mentally, rehearsing what Victoria had coached me to say and anticipating Harold's likely responses. This wasn't about emotional confrontation, but strategic revelation, showing Harold precisely enough of my knowledge to destabilize his confidence without revealing the full extent of our investigation. I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit I had worn to hospital board functions, professional rather than personal. I applied minimal makeup and styled my silver-streaked hair in its usual neat bob. Nothing in my appearance would suggest distress or dramatic change. The message would be contained entirely in my words and the documents I would present as I laid out the final folder, arranging everything with the precision that had characterized my life's work. As nurse, mother, volunteer, and wife, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For decades, I had supported Harold's advancement, maintained our home, raised our children, and managed the complex social relationships his position required. I had done all this with competence and grace, often at the expense of my own ambitions and identity. Now those same skills, organization, attention to detail, emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, would serve an entirely different purpose. They would help me reclaim not just my fair share of our marital assets, but something far more valuable: my sense of self as an independent, capable woman with a future still unfolding. As I turned out the dining room lights and headed upstairs to bed, I realized that regardless of how tomorrow's meeting unfolded, something fundamental had already changed. The woman Harold had assumed would quietly accept whatever terms he offered no longer existed, if indeed she ever had. In her place stood someone stronger, more determined, and far less accommodating than he had ever truly known. The Eleanor who would greet Harold tomorrow wasn't a new creation born of crisis, but the woman I had always been beneath the accommodating exterior I had cultivated as his wife. It was time for Harold to meet her, and for me to fully embrace her myself. Harold arrived promptly at 10 a.m., dressed casually but expensively in the new style he had adopted since his relationship with Patricia began. Tailored chinos, a cashmere, sweater, and Italian loafers that probably cost more than a month's grocery budget. He carried a slim leather briefcase monogrammed with his initials, a recent acquisition I'd never seen before. The November morning light streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating the carefully arranged folders I had positioned on the polished mahogany table. Harold paused briefly in the doorway, his eyes flickering over the organized documents before settling on me with a practiced expression of sympathetic determination. "Eleanor," he began, setting his briefcase on the table without glancing at my carefully arranged materials. "I hope you've had time to review the agreement. As I mentioned, I believe the terms are quite fair." He smelled of an unfamiliar cologne, something expensive and subtle that reinforced the sense that I was dealing with a version of Harold I had never truly known. Or perhaps, more accurately, a version that had always existed beneath the familiar surface, now emerging fully formed as he prepared to step into his new life. "I've reviewed it," I replied calmly, gesturing for him to sit across from me. "And I've also reviewed some other documents I thought might be relevant to our discussion." For the first time, Harold seemed to notice the folders spread across the table. His expression flickered briefly before settling back into benign confidence. The slight adjustment of his glasses, a nervous habit from our early years that had mostly disappeared, was the only indication that my preparedness had unsettled him. "Oh? What documents?" "Records of our financial history," I said, opening the nearest folder. "For instance, the original investment of my inheritance from my father into your medical consulting business in 1995. The funds that established the operational infrastructure while you developed client relationships." I slid forward the bank records showing the $85,000 transfer from my father's estate, money that had been earmarked for my own professional advancement, but that I had instead invested in our shared future. Harold shifted slightly in his chair. "That was nearly 30 years ago, Eleanor, and the business was dissolved when I took the position at Boston Memorial." "Not dissolved," I corrected, sliding another document forward. "Restructured into Bennett Healthcare Advisors. which continues to generate approximately $400,000 annually in passive income from the intellectual property and systems you developed, systems I helped create and document during those early years. The color drained slightly from Harold's face. You've been investigating me? I've been reviewing our marital assets, I countered. Assets conspicuously absent from your proposed settlement. His fingers tapped lightly on the table. Another. Tell from our early marriage that emerged only when he felt cornered. Eleanor, we both know you weren't actively involved in the business operations after the initial setup. Active involvement isn't the only measure of contribution, Harold, I replied, maintaining the calm, factual tone Victoria had coached me to use. My management of household, children, and social obligations freed you to develop the business without distraction. My healthcare background informed many of the systems you implemented. My editing improved the proposals and presentations that secured your client base. I opened another folder, this one containing records of the main property. Then there's the vacation home you've excluded from the agreement, the one you claim as separate property through family inheritance. According to these renovation and maintenance records, I've personally invested over $300,000 and countless hours in that property over 30 years, substantially increasing its value and transforming it from the dilapidated cottage it was when we received it. I laid out photographs showing the dramatic transformation, from the sagging porch and peeling paint of the original structure to the charming blue-gray clapboard with white trim and lush gardens it had become under my stewardship. Harold's expression had shifted from confidence to wariness. Eleanor, this level of detail seems unnecessarily adversarial. I thought we could handle this amicably. Amicably doesn't mean inequitably, I replied. And speaking of equity, I'm particularly interested in discussing the approximately $3 million you've transferred to separate accounts and investment vehicles over the past 14 months. At this, Harold's composure cracked visibly. His hand, reaching for his water glass, froze midair. How did you... No, I finished for him. Harold, who do you think has prepared our tax documents for 40 years? Who maintained records of every investment decision? Who organized the financial information for our estate planning? Did you really believe I was ignorant of our financial position? For perhaps the first time in our marriage, Harold looked at me with genuine surprise. And a dawning recognition that I was not the passive participant he had assumed me to be. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, his voice taking on a defensive edge. I'm not proposing anything yet, I replied calmly. I'm merely establishing that I have a comprehensive understanding of our actual marital assets and my contributions to them. When I do make a proposal, it will reflect that reality rather than the incomplete picture your agreement presents. Harold's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. If you're planning to drag this out with excessive legal maneuvering, I'm planning to ensure a fair resolution, I interrupted. One that acknowledges 45 years of partnership rather than erasing them. I gathered my materials into a neat stack, signaling the conclusion of our meeting. My attorney will be contacting your representative next week to begin formal discovery proceedings. I suggest you ensure all financial disclosures are complete and accurate. Judges tend to view deliberate omissions quite unfavorably. Harold stared at me, his familiar face suddenly unreadable. I never thought you would approach this like this. Like what, Harold? Like someone who values herself and her contributions? Like someone who won't be dismissed after dedicating her entire adult life to supporting your success? I stood, maintaining the calm dignity that had become my shield. You chose to end our marriage, Harold. That's your right. But you don't get to dictate the terms under which I'll rebuild my life afterward. As he gathered his briefcase and stood to leave, a new expression crossed his face, something between bewilderment and reluctant respect. Where did this Eleanor come from? He asked, almost to himself. She's always been here, I replied quietly. You just never needed to see her before. After Harold left, I sat alone in the dining room, oddly serene despite the confrontation. For decades, I had calibrated my responses to maintain harmony, to support Harold's ego and ambitions, to be the accommodating partner who made his success possible. The freedom to speak my truth without calculating its impact on his feelings was exhilarating. My phone rang within the hour, Victoria calling for an update on the meeting. "How did it go?" she asked. "He was shocked," I replied. "He came in expecting perfunctory agreement or perhaps minor negotiation. He left understanding this will be a completely different process than he anticipated." "Good," Victoria approved. "The psychological advantage is significant. Men like Harold aren't accustomed to being challenged, especially by women they've categorized as supportive rather than assertive." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll formally request comprehensive financial disclosure. Given what you've already shown him, he'll likely provide more complete information to avoid court-ordered discovery, which would be both public and potentially embarrassing." 2 days later, Harold's attorney contacted Victoria to request a formal settlement meeting rather than proceeding directly to litigation. Victoria called me immediately. "He's rattled," she explained. "Your demonstration that you have substantial financial knowledge and documentation has him concerned about what might emerge during formal discovery." "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We agree to the meeting, but make it clear we expect complete financial disclosure beforehand. This gives Harold an opportunity to provide a more honest accounting before we're forced to compel it through legal channels." The following week, we received an updated financial disclosure that included many, though not all, of the assets missing from the original proposal. The Bennett Healthcare Advisor's income stream was acknowledged, as was Harold's. Interest in a medical technology investment group he had joined 5 years earlier. Several accounts previously omitted were now listed, though Catherine identified at least 2 significant investment vehicles still missing. Victoria prepared a response that tactfully noted these continued omissions while accepting the settlement. Meeting scheduled for 2 weeks later. "We're establishing a pattern," she explained, "documenting Harold's reluctance to provide full disclosure voluntarily, which strengthens our position if we eventually need court intervention." During this period, I faced another challenge. Our children had begun asking more pointed questions about their father's absence and my uncharacteristic evasiveness. Jennifer, our oldest and most perceptive, called one evening after her own children. "We're in bed. Mom, what's really going on with you and Dad? He's been staying at a friend's place for weeks, and you're being suspiciously vague. Are you separated?" I sighed, recognizing the time for partial truths had passed. "Your father has asked for a divorce," I said simply. The shocked silence that followed spoke volumes. "Divorce? After 45 years? Why?" "That's something you should discuss with him," I replied. "But it involves a relationship with someone else?" Jennifer's response combined disbelief and anger. "He's having an affair? At 67? Who?" She stopped suddenly. "Is it Patricia Miller? The one who's always cornering him at hospital events?" I neither confirmed nor denied, unwilling to position our children against their father despite his actions. "Jennifer, I'm handling this situation. I have good legal counsel and I'm protecting my interests. What I need from you and your brothers isn't outrage on my behalf, but patience while this process unfolds." Similar conversations with David and Michael followed, each with its own emotional tenor. David, the attorney, immediately offered legal connections and strategic advice. Michael, always our most sensitive child, expressed profound sadness and confusion about his father's choices. All 3 initially wanted to confront Harold directly, but I discouraged this. "Your relationship with your father exists independently of his relationship with me," I told them. "I don't want his choices to disrupt your connection with him, however disappointed you may be in his behavior." This stance wasn't entirely altruistic. I recognized that maintaining a dignified, non-vindictive approach would serve my interests better than encouraging family division. Harold valued his image as a father. Having our children express disappointment rather than anger would affect him more deeply than outright condemnation. As the settlement meeting approached, Harold made an unexpected move. He called on a Sunday evening, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "Eleanor," he began, an unusual hesitancy in his voice. "Before our attorneys meet, I wonder if we might have dinner, just the two of us. There are things I'd like to discuss privately." I considered his request carefully. Victoria had advised against any unofficial meetings, concerned that Harold might attempt to emotionally manipulate me outside the structured environment of legal representation. "What specifically did you want to discuss, Harold?" I asked. He paused. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about your contributions to our life together. I may have undervalued certain aspects in my initial proposal." This admission, however minimal, represented a significant shift from his previous position. "Are you prepared to provide complete financial disclosure?" I asked, "including the Cayman Islands investment account and the technology patent royalties?" His sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit the mark. These were the two significant assets Catherine had identified as still missing from his updated disclosure. "How did you—" He stopped himself. "Yes, complete disclosure." "Then I'll meet you," I agreed. "But I'll be bringing documentation with me, and anything we discuss will need to be formalized through our attorneys." We arranged to meet at Marcello's, a small Italian restaurant we had frequented for anniversary dinners in years past. The choice of venue seemed deliberate on Harold's part, a nostalgic setting that might soften my resolve. I arrived 10 minutes early, deliberately selecting a table in the main dining room rather than the intimate corner booth where we had traditionally sat. I wore a simple but elegant black dress with a strand of pearls Harold had given me for our 40th anniversary, a calculated choice that reminded him of our shared history without appearing sentimental. Harold arrived precisely on time, looking uncharacteristically uncertain as he approached the table. He had aged visibly in the weeks since our confrontation, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slightly hunched. For a moment, I felt an unwelcome flicker of concern before reminding myself that his discomfort was a natural consequence of his own actions. "Eleanor," he said, awkwardly leaning in as if to kiss my cheek before thinking better of it, and simply taking his seat. "Thank you for meeting me." "You said you wanted to discuss something specific," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but not cold. Harold fidgeted with his water glass, another uncharacteristic display of nervousness. "I've been thinking about our situation, about how we got here." "And where exactly is here, Harold?" I asked quietly. He looked up, momentarily confused. "The divorce, obviously." "No," I corrected. "The divorce is where you've decided we should go. Here is the place where you felt entitled to discard 45 years of marriage with papers delivered at your mother's funeral. Here is where you deliberately concealed assets we built together so you could start fresh with Patricia while leaving me with a fraction of what I helped create." Harold flinched. "That's not entirely fair, Eleanor. Isn't it?" I opened the slim portfolio I had brought, removing several documents. "This is a complete accounting of the assets you've continued to omit from your disclosures. The technology, patent royalties alone represent over $800,000 in annual income that doesn't appear anywhere in your financial statements." I slid the papers across the table. "I'm not interested in revenge, Harold. I don't want to destroy your reputation or damage your relationship with our children, but I will not, cannot, accept being erased from the life we built together." Harold studied the documents, his expression moving from defiance to resignation. "How did you find all this?" "I've used the best financial advisors to structure these holdings. I may have been your wife, but I was never your fool," I said simply. "I've managed our financial documentation for decades. Did you really think?" I wouldn't recognize unusual transactions or missing accounts. For a long moment, Harold said nothing, just stared at the evidence of his attempted deception. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his expression, a recognition I hadn't seen before. "You're formidable, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I ever truly appreciated that." "No," I agreed. "You didn't. You saw what you expected to see. A supportive wife whose value was defined by her relationship to you rather than her own capabilities." Harold set down the papers with a sigh. "What do you want, Eleanor? Just tell me straight out." "I want what I've earned," I replied. 50% of all marital assets, including business interests and investment accounts. I want my role in the development of Bennett Healthcare Advisors formally acknowledged in company documentation. I want co-ownership of the main property with the option to buy out your share if I choose. I paused, then added, "And I want this resolved quickly and privately, without court proceedings that would damage your professional standing and hurt our children." Harold nodded slowly. "And if I agree to these terms, then we both move forward with dignity. You get your new life with Patricia without a messy public battle, and I get the resources and recognition I deserve to build whatever comes next for me." For perhaps the first time in our conversation, Harold looked directly into my eyes, truly seeing me. "I underestimated you, Eleanor. I always have." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." The meeting ended with a tentative agreement to have our attorneys draft new settlement terms based on our discussion. As we prepared to leave, Harold asked an unexpected question. "Are you happy, Eleanor? Were you ever truly happy with me?" Thine question caught me off guard with its surprising vulnerability. For a moment I saw glimpses of the young man I had married. Earnest, uncertain despite his outward confidence. "There were many happy years, Harold," I answered honestly. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner and started seeing me as a function in your life. Perhaps the better question isn't whether I was happy, but whether either of us was fully present in our marriage for the past decade." He nodded slowly, accepting this truth. "And now? What will you do after?" I smiled slightly. "That's the most interesting question of all, isn't it? For the first time in nearly 50 years, the answer is entirely up to me." As I walked to my car, leaving Harold standing thoughtfully outside the restaurant, I felt an unexpected lightness. The confrontation I had feared for weeks had transformed into something else entirely. Not a battle, but a reclamation of my own worth. Not just in financial terms, but in the fundamental recognition of who I was and had always been. The woman who would emerge from this divorce would not be defined by loss or abandonment. She would be defined by her own choices, her own rediscovered strength, and a future she would design entirely for herself. Harold's request for divorce at his mother's funeral had been meant to end something. Instead, it had become the unexpected, beginning of my most authentic chapter. 3 weeks after our dinner at Marcello's, I signed the revised divorce agreement in Victoria's office. The terms reflected almost everything I had asked for: equal division of all marital assets, including those Harold had initially attempted to conceal, co-ownership of the main property, formal acknowledgement of my role in establishing Bennett Healthcare Advisors, and a clean break that would allow both of us to move forward with our lives. "You've achieved an exceptional outcome, Eleanor," Victoria said as I returned the pen to its holder. "Most divorce settlements, especially after long marriages, don't result in such equitable terms without protracted litigation. Harold values his reputation above almost everything else," I replied. Once he understood I had the documentation to prove his financial maneuvering, a fair settlement became his most rational option. What I didn't say was that I suspected something beyond pragmatic self-interest had influenced Harold's decision. During our dinner, I had glimpsed moments of genuine recognition, perhaps even regret, in his eyes. Not regret about ending our marriage, but about the manner in which he had attempted to do so, and the dismissive assumptions he had made about me in the process. The divorce would become final in 90 days, the legal conclusion to 45 years of shared life. As I left Victoria's office that crisp December afternoon, I felt neither triumph nor sadness, but a profound sense of transition. One chapter ending, another beginning. Now came the truly challenging part, figuring out who Eleanor Bennett would be without the Bennett and all it had represented. The first decision was straightforward. I would not remain in our Brookline home, despite having secured ownership in the settlement. The house, with its 5 bedrooms and formal entertaining spaces, had been designed around Harold's position and our life as a couple. Every corner held memories, some cherished, but others now painful in their revision. I hired a real estate agent the following week, a brisk, efficient woman named Judith who specialized in high-end properties. "This will move quickly," she assured me after walking through the house. The neighborhood, the architectural details, the garden. It's exactly what many executives with families are looking for. She was right. Within a month, we had 3 serious offers, all above asking price. I accepted the one from a surgeon and her professor husband with 3 children, a family who would fill the rooms with new life and purpose. The question of where I would go required more reflection. Our children had immediately offered solutions. Jennifer and her husband suggested their in-law apartment in suburban Newton. David proposed I relocate to Providence where he practiced law. Michael thought I might enjoy Washington, D.C., where his research institute offered faculty housing that occasionally accommodated relatives. Their concern touched me deeply, but I declined all 3 offers. "This is my opportunity to choose for myself," I explained during our family Christmas gathering. A somewhat subdued affair held at Jennifer's house, rather than our traditional home location. I need to discover what I want, not just what would be practical or comfortable. What I wanted, I realized during long walks through Boston's winter bear parks, was to reconnect with the young woman who had once had dreams and ambitions of her own, before they became subsumed by marriage and motherhood. Not to recapture youth, that would be both impossible and undesirable, but to rediscover the core of who I had been and might become again. The answer came unexpectedly during a lunch with Elizabeth Winters, my former nursing mentor. "The hospital is expanding its patient advocacy program," she mentioned as we discussed changes in healthcare. "We're particularly focused on elderly patients navigating complex treatments. Someone with both clinical knowledge and life experience would be invaluable." "Are you suggesting I consider applying?" I asked, surprised. Elizabeth smiled. "I'm suggesting you might have contributions to make that extend beyond volunteer committees. Your nursing background combined with decades of experience in healthcare administration through Harold's work creates a unique perspective." "I haven't practiced nursing in over 40 years, I reminded her. "You wouldn't be providing direct clinical care," Elizabeth clarified. "This role focuses on helping patients understand their options, navigate institutional systems, and ensure their voices are heard in treatment decisions. Your experience as both a healthcare professional and a patient's family member during Harold's heart issues gives you insights many lack." The possibility intrigued me. Throughout my married life, I had maintained connection to healthcare through volunteer work and Harold's career, but always in an auxiliary capacity. The idea of having a formal role, however part-time, with professional recognition and responsibilities, awakened something I had long suppressed. I'd need to update my knowledge, I mused. Healthcare has changed dramatically since I practiced. Boston University offers a certificate program in patient advocacy, Elizabeth replied. 4 months, designed for healthcare professionals returning to practice or transitioning to new roles. The next cohort starts in February. I enrolled the following week, using a portion of my settlement to cover the tuition. The program would require 2 days of coursework weekly, plus clinical observations and projects. At 67, I was by far the oldest student in the cohort of 20, among nurses and social workers primarily in their 30s and 40s. I'm Eleanor Clark, I introduced myself at the orientation session, deliberately reverting to my maiden name though the divorce wasn't yet final. The name felt both foreign and familiar on my tongue, a reclaiming of identity I had set aside decades earlier. The coursework was challenging in the best possible way, requiring me to engage with new technologies, updated ethical frameworks, and significant changes in healthcare delivery systems. My decades away from formal education made certain aspects difficult: the online learning platforms, the pace of information, the expectation of technological fluency. But my life experience provided context and perspective many younger students lacked. During this period of educational renewal, I also made decisions about my living situation. After considerable research, I purchased a 2-bedroom condominium in Cambridge, a light-filled space in a converted factory building with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and expansive windows overlooking the Charles River. The neighborhood, bustled with academic energy from nearby universities, offered excellent public transportation, and provided the urban vitality I had missed in Brookline's more sedate environment. "It's so different from the house," Jennifer commented during her first visit, running her hand along the industrial steel countertops in the open-concept kitchen. "I can't imagine Dad here at all." "That's rather the point," I replied with a smile. "This isn't about accommodating what your father would prefer. It's about creating a space that reflects who I am now." Who I was now included someone who was discovering unexpected pleasure in independence. I filled my new home with books I had always wanted to read but never found time for. I attended chamber music concerts alone, enjoying the ability to linger, afterward, without checking whether Harold was growing impatient. I took a watercolor class at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, awkwardly but joyfully producing landscapes that would never grace a gallery but gave me immense satisfaction. The divorce became final on a Thursday in early March. The legal notification arrived while I was studying for a certification exam on healthcare decision-making capacity. I signed for the certified letter, opened it at my desk overlooking the river, then returned to my textbooks without ceremony. The legal dissolution of my marriage felt anticlimactic compared to the internal dissolution that had already occurred, and the reconstruction of self that was actively underway. Harold called that evening, his voice carrying the formal politeness that had characterized our interactions since the settlement negotiations. "I received the notification today," he said. "I wanted to check that you're doing all right." "I'm fine, Harold," I replied honestly. "I'm in the middle of studying for an exam, actually." "An exam?" The surprise in his voice was evident. "For what?" "I'm completing a certificate program in patient advocacy. I'll be working part-time at Boston Memorial starting this summer." The silence that followed spoke volumes. In all our discussions about the divorce and future arrangements, Harold had never once asked about my plans beyond the practical details of where I would live and how I would manage financially. The assumption, unspoken but palpable, had been that I would simply continue in a diminished version of my previous life. Smaller home, fewer social obligations, but essentially the same retired homemaker role. "That's unexpected," he finally said. "But good, I suppose, if that's what you want." "It is what I want," I confirmed. "Among other things I'm discovering about myself." Another pause. "Eleanor, he began, then stopped. "Patricia and I are getting married in June. Small ceremony. The children already know." The news settled over me with surprising gentleness. 6 months earlier, it would have devastated me. Now it felt like information about someone else's life, relevant to our children and our social circle, but increasingly tangential to my everyday existence. "I wish you happiness, Harold," I said, and meant it. "Life is too short for anything less." After we hung up, I returned to my studies, but found myself distracted by reflection. Harold was proceeding exactly as one might expect, maintaining continuity by replacing one marital relationship with another. His life's framework would remain essentially unchanged: a wife to manage social obligations, a comfortable home, a familiar routine with different companionship. My path was proving far less predictable, even to myself. Each week seemed to bring new discoveries about what I enjoyed, what challenged me, what I wanted to pursue further. The pattern recognition skills I had honed over decades of nursing and family management were finding new applications in my coursework. My understanding of administrative systems, absorbed through years at Harold's side, provided insights into institutional healthcare that many classmates found valuable. Most surprisingly, I discovered a talent for public speaking during classroom presentations. Years of chairing charitable committees and introducing Harold at hospital functions had apparently developed skills I had never recognized as significant. My clinical instructor suggested I consider developing workshops for other advocates once. I completed the program. "You have a gift for making complex information accessible," she noted after I presented on navigating Medicare regulations. "And your life experience adds credibility younger advocates can't match." This comment sparked a conversation with Catherine Morgan at the Healthcare Advocacy Foundation where I had volunteered. When I mentioned my certification program and post-divorce reinvention, she immediately suggested a potential collaboration. "We've been wanting to develop programming specifically for seniors navigating healthcare transitions," she explained, over coffee in her office. "You bring the perfect combination of professional training and personal experience. Would you consider consulting with us to design a pilot program?" By the time my divorce had been final for 3 months, I had 3 part-time professional commitments: the patient advocacy position at Boston Memorial that would begin in July, the curriculum development project with Catherine's foundation, and a workshop series I was creating for a community health center. None individually provided the income Harold's career had generated, but together with my divorce settlement, they created financial security while offering something far more valuable: purpose and recognition. My new life was taking shape, piece by piece, choice by choice. I maintained connections with friends from my married life, who had made efforts to maintain relationships with me as an individual, rather than as half of a couple. I developed new friendships through my classes and professional projects. I even cautiously began dating, accepting dinner invitations from a retired English professor. I met at a museum lecture and a widowed cardiologist who served on the hospital ethics committee. These evening outings were awkward at first. I hadn't dated since the 1970s, and the rules had certainly changed. But they reinforced an important truth. Romantic partnership was an option but not a necessity in this new chapter. My sense of self no longer depended on reflection in someone else's eyes. One bright June afternoon, I took the train to the Maine coast to visit my vacation property. Under the settlement terms, Harold and I shared ownership, but he had agreed I could use it exclusively during the summer while he and Patricia would have access in the fall. I hadn't visited since before Margaret's death, and I approached the familiar cedar-shingled cottage with mixed emotions. The gardens I had painstakingly developed over decades greeted me first, perennials now blooming in colorful profusion without my tending. The blueberry bushes needed pruning, the rose arbor required repair, but the fundamental beauty remained. Inside, the cottage felt simultaneously familiar and strange. I had chosen every piece of furniture, every paint color, every decorative object, yet the space now held a different energy. I spent 3 days there, walking the rocky shoreline, reacquainting myself with local shopkeepers, and considering what this place meant in my new life. On the final morning, sitting on the porch with coffee as the sun rose over the Atlantic, I made a decision. This place, unlike the Brookline house, was worth keeping. Not because of its connection to the past, but because of what it offered. For the future, peace, beauty, and a setting where my children and grandchildren could continue gathering for generations. I would buy out Harold's share, using a portion of my settlement funds. The cottage would become my summer sanctuary and family gathering place, a legacy I would create and maintain on my own terms. As I locked up to return to Cambridge, I paused to look back at the weathered gray cottage against the backdrop of spruce trees and ocean. For decades, this place had been the Bennett summer home, an extension of our married identity. Now it would become something else, a physical manifestation of my reclaimed independence and continuing connection to what mattered most. The transformation of place paralleled my internal transformation. I was no longer defining myself primarily through relationships, wife, mother, grandmother, though these remained precious parts of my identity. At 67, I was becoming more authentically myself than perhaps I had ever been, integrating all I had learned through my roles while expanding beyond their limitations. Harold had handed me divorce papers at his mother's funeral, expecting compliance and perhaps even gratitude for his generous terms. Instead, his attempt to discard me had catalyzed a profound awakening. The woman he had underestimated, the woman whose contributions he had minimized, the woman he assumed would quietly disappear into diminished existence, that woman had emerged stronger, more determined, and more fully herself than either of us could have imagined. When I received the invitation to Harold and Patricia's wedding, a courtesy extended primarily for our children's sake, I declined politely, citing a professional commitment. The patient advocacy training program culminated that weekend with a certification ceremony I had worked hard to reach. Between attending my ex-husband's wedding and celebrating my own achievement, the choice was clear. As I accepted my certification, surrounded by classmates and new colleagues, I felt no bitterness toward Harold. His actions, however painful at the time, had ultimately given me an unexpected gift, the opportunity to discover who Eleanor Clark truly was, beyond the roles and responsibilities that had defined me for decades. At 67, I wasn't simply starting over. I was starting anew, building on a foundation of experience while exploring possibilities I had never imagined. The woman who had signed divorce papers with dignified composure at a funeral reception had been shell-shocked but determined. The woman receiving professional certification 6 months later was thriving in ways that surprised everyone, especially herself. Life rarely follows the narratives we expect. Sometimes its most profound gifts arrive disguised as losses. Harold had asked for divorce, believing he was moving toward greater happiness while consigning me to a diminished existence. The reality proved far more complex and ultimately liberating. For us both. He got the freedom he sought with Patricia, while I discovered a capacity for reinvention I never knew I possessed. The last chapter of my life was proving to be not an epilogue, but a new beginning. One written entirely in my own hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.